Welcome to Economy Disrupted. I'm Stephanie Segal, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS and co-host of Economy Disrupted. This week, we're going to be discussing the US presidential election, which concludes, or at least the voting stage of it concludes tomorrow. As you watch, submit your questions at the link below.
And I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Delighted to have you with us. We're going to have our, sadly, final episode of the year today, but the good news is we have a terrific guest, and we're going to speak with him for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have our usual segment, The Bottom Line. So please stick around for that. In the meantime, let me introduce our guest, our boss, John Hamre, who is CEO and president of CSIS. He also holds the Langone Chair in American Leadership. Dr. Hamre, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with both of you. It's a real privilege.
Well, it's terrific for us. We really appreciate this. It'll really put a great bow on our series, which has been a lot of fun. But we're going to try and touch on some of the issues that we've been talking about over the last 12 episodes. But let me start with a pretty broad question about the election. I mean, most elections have consequences, as they say, but those are focused largely around policy differences between the parties. One party takes policy in one direction or another. You know, there are policy issues at stake here, and I want to ask about a couple of those in a second. But just it feels like there's something broader at stake here about our democracy, about the U.S. position in the world. Do you want to offer thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I think America periodically has, you know, kind of convulsive elections where we're thinking about our future. We've had numerous episodes like that in the 1840s, 1850s, in the 1880s and 90s, in the 1920s. I mean, we've had episodes like that. I think this is of that scale because I think it's a question about how does America approach the world, and what role does the government play in defining the agenda that America brings to the world? I think that's really the fundamental question in this election. We have President Trump, who feels that the last 60 or 70 years, America has leaned forward in an international dimension that was at the expense of our national interest. And we have a Joe Biden that is saying the world has transformed. America has to be a leader. We can't hide from the world, and we have to lean forward and master this new world. I think those are the two worlds we're facing, and that's a big decision in this election.
Yeah, it surely is. Let me ask about a couple of specific things. You sort of touched on our role in the world, and let me ask about multilateral institutions in particular, and you know, how big a difference do you see here in terms of our approach, the U.S. approach to you know, institutions that we helped create, whether you know, the World Trade Organization or more security-focused arrangements like NATO. Are these things going to be, is there going to be a fundamental difference of approach depending on who wins tomorrow?
Well, you know, we helped create those institutions, you know, it started actually during the World War II, but afterwards, and it was to define America's role in the world. Now, I think the current world is largely the same, but a little bit more nuanced. When I meet with especially our young colleagues and talk about it, I always say, you know, all of the complex problems in the world are horizontal, and all of the governments are vertical. And so how do we solve or deal with really complicated problems which go beyond the remit of one government? And I think that still is the threshold question. You know, my own personal view is that these challenges are too complicated and they reach beyond the remit of the U.S. government, despite our strength. And we do have to find ways to work with other countries. And we probably need to revitalize, reform some of these multilateral institutions. But the idea of collaboration internationally, I think, is probably more important now than ever.
Yeah, no, good point. And I do think there's probably broad agreement about, I mean, the organization that I mentioned that we're most interested in, the WTO, there's widespread agreement that organization is not working the way it was intended to originally, and it needs to be updated and reformed, but that it is still, an important part of the system and getting our interests advanced. That's probably a sort of broad consensus, but that's terrific. Let me just, before I want to bring Stephanie in, but let me just ask one more substantive question. Another difficult issue where it feels like there's a bit of a fork in the road, which is climate change. So we had Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary, on the show last time. And he said about climate change that it's, quote, the most certain and formidable economic challenge that the world faces. So it's a big deal. You've seen Japan now committing to net carbon neutrality by 2050. Other countries seem to be following. It feels as though we're headed towards a kind of new conversation about climate change. Is that what we should expect after tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, irrespective of the election tomorrow, I think the broad populace has decided that climate change is a reality and something they consider to be very important. The sad aspect of our current day is that climate change is a totem identifier of tribal loyalty. And, Democrats reflexively believe climate change is crucial and vital and is our highest priority. Republicans reflexively, as a tribal matter, decide this isn't certain, science isn't reliable, and it shouldn't guide us. Certainly, it appears that the public has shifted its sentiments more towards the perspective of Democrats, but Republicans hold on to that identity, that tribal identity that is blocking, action. And that's going to be a big problem going forward. Even if tomorrow the election and Biden is elected, he's still going to confront a significant opposition, from Republicans about this question.
Yeah, no, definitely a big topic of difference there and importance. So with that, Stephanie?
Well, I was just going to say on the climate talk, I did take some inspiration from the episode last week, given Secretary Paulson's kind of longstanding commitment on this issue, also his kind of political affiliation. And as Matt and I have been talking about, a number of financial institutions and financial regulators have actually been talking about climate change and just kind of the economic realities from it. So maybe the economy and economic issues can kind of pull forward that debate. We can be hopeful, I guess, in that sense. Dr. Hamre, I wanted to ask you about an issue that really is the backdrop for tomorrow's election, and that's COVID-19. Actually, I had two questions for you. The first one was what the pandemic has revealed that was either unappreciated or underappreciated, either about the US and or the world, that was underappreciated before the pandemic. And then in terms of the post-COVID-19 recovery, what do you think the priorities should be for the US, whether it's on economic policy or just policies more broadly for the year ahead?
Golly. Let me just say, I think the biggest lesson of COVID is that globalization really favored only one dimension. It really only focused on one dimension, and that was lowest cost. So supply chains were organized around lowest cost for inputs into final products. I think what um, we're learning from the pandemic is that the term of art that's emerging is resilience. You know, how do companies and countries have resilience to deal with unanticipated problems? And globalization just made it so narrowly based on lowest price and just-in-time delivery. And I think that's shifting. Now, the question is, where does it go? Our friends in Mexico are hoping that they can capture the zeitgeist here of this time and say we will become the producer reliably for resiliency in a post-COVID environment. I think the jury's out on that, but I think they're certainly going to try. I think the real question about supply chains is that no country has kind of the deep integrated experience that China has to pull all the pieces together. So if you want to build a factory that's going to assemble components to something you're manufacturing, you want to do that in China. You also get expedited procedures to get to the seaport, to put it on a container. You get expedited procedures, regulatory procedures to get it registered. I mean, China has put this together in a powerful way. And I don't think there are any other countries in the world that have quite figured out this level of sophistication to do it. So I do personally think the rhetoric about decoupling is overstated, in my view. I think economics is still going to hold us very much to sourcing in China because they've got the whole package. I don't think Vietnam has the whole package. I don't think Malaysia has the whole package, or Thailand. So I think this is not going to be a radical transformation the way some people think it might be.
And what do you think about as far as what it's revealed domestically about the United States? And I take kind of the supply chain point kind of feeds into a deglobalization narrative prior to COVID-19. But where COVID-19 seems to really have shocked us, I think, is kind of on the domestic side, revealing things about the United States. What are your thoughts there?
Well, in many ways, I think the COVID economic crisis, not the medical crisis, but the COVID economic crisis, is a story about education. Knowledge workers, people that work with their minds, that that's the way that they put bread on the table. They're doing pretty well. And you look at the data around the country, second quartile, third quartile, fourth quartile workers that are largely working with their minds, they're doing pretty well. Where there's great stress in the country is in first and second quartile workers, where education doesn't put them in that space. I think this COVID crisis is very much a story about the need to transform America's educational system. We have got to get Americans working up on a higher level in the value chain. And what I just hate to say it, it's so-called K recovery. Half of the group is up, half of the group is down. And what's that dividing point? It's educational accomplishment.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at when I was asking about kind of the priorities then into 2021 and fueling the recovery. Would you is education kind of number one on your list then, as far as what we need to do as a country?
It's certainly number one on my list, but I think the question is, what is the national approach to this? I don't think it is, free tuition at colleges. I think it has to be a much richer, broader base where, people that want to work with their hands, they feel comfortable working, physically with their hands in producing value, have to be valued in our society. We don't, the Europeans are pretty good about this. I mean, the Europeans hold, annual competitions. Who's the best, pastry chef in France? Who's the best plumber in Germany? Do we do anything like that in this country? No. We do not honor the people in this country that work with their hands. We honor the people that work with their minds, but we have to, I think, start adopting a national commitment to honor everybody in this country that is making productive value input to society. But we do not do that with blue collar workers in America. It's a shame. It's a shame.
That's a terrific point, and something that I hope maybe we can circle back to when I ask you a little bit about our Trade Commission, where we touched on some of that. But let me first, if I may, ask you about China. You've already mentioned China, but at CSIS we're doing a lot more work on economics, and a lot of it seems to be geared towards the emerging, evolving competition with China in the economic space. I think the question is, do you think that is something that is going to be unchangeable? Everybody has been pointing out that President Trump and his administration have really, in a way, done a service by highlighting the challenges that we face with China, even if people disagree with some of his tactics and tone of approaching it. But is that something that's going to continue even under a Biden administration? Are we locked in this sort of economic competition? And what's the significance of that?
Well, Matt, I don't think we have properly yet defined the nature of this competition. We're all used to the last 30 years where China was the low-cost producer of commoditized things, tennis shoes and iPhones. They were instrumental in building these things to sell in our markets at the lowest cost of production. I think that's our mindset. China is trying to change that. China is trying to find its way to a higher value segment of the market where they get better returns off of their inputs, not just being low cost, touch labor input into manufacturing goods. Now, they've set on that course. What is it, China 2025 or whatever this thing is. They've identified the pathway for success for them. And I look at it and I say, it's pretty rational. This is not irrational national policy. They've identified things that are going to be important for their economy and citizens to get higher up on the value chain. So that's understandable. But we do have a profound difference in the way we're approaching this. I mean, our country wants to capture the benefit of new technology and make it valuable for our employees too. Okay, we both have the same goal, but the Chinese have adopted state capitalism to do this and state-owned enterprises. So, they have decided to put resources into government corporations. These corporations, they don't have cost of capital. That's not an issue. They don't have to make profits. Their goal is to employ a lot of people, and it's not about profitability. Now, in the Western system, the government doesn't choose winners and losers in the marketplace. We try to establish a level, neutral playing field, but everybody's out there to compete. So we have American companies that are competing against Chinese companies on the most cutting edge technology, but Chinese companies don't have to worry about making a profit, do not have to worry about cost of capital. They always get access to it. And the government helps them with the informal value things like, spying on the customer to get a better idea about how they're thinking about the negotiation. We don't do that, in our country. So I think the great challenge going forward, Matt, is we're increasingly competing against each other in global markets, but we approach it with a neutral perspective as far as it comes to companies. They have to win, and we have to make sure the legal framework is honest. In China, they have to win, but they get great privileges, with access to capital and privileged positions.
Well, actually, let me follow up on that in a way by asking about a topic that we've discussed and you're very focused on, which is standards. But let me get there by frame it for our audience by saying that we have a trade commission, a high-level trade commission at CSIS, co-chaired by Fred Smith, Charlene Barshevsky, and Bill Brock. We've already been issuing some of our output. We still have to come sort of core talk about trade policy and the WTO reform, but we've already issued papers on workforce reform and innovation, investing in innovation, because those domestic pillars, as we've been discussing here, are really fundamental to our position in the world. Within the innovation paper, one of the topics we've been zeroing in on is standard setting. The US used to basically set the standards because we made the best stuff and there was nobody else really in the room when we were saying this is what it's going to be. That's no longer true. We have a lot of people competing. As you say, a lot of those countries, it's China, but it's also Europe, are doing this top down, whereas the US is relying on its, companies and its, the private sector to really drive this debate about standards. How do we compete in that context, and what is the government's role working with government, with private sector?
Matt, forgive me for giving a little bit of a longer prelude to the answer here. From the very beginning of this country, standard setting became important because we were 13 independent colonies. We wanted to create ourselves into a coherent country, but we needed to know that a pound of sugar weighed the same in Virginia and in New York. That a pound of nails manufactured in Pennsylvania weighed the same as in Georgia. It really mattered for us to establish trustworthy norms for standards. it became foundational to build a country. Now, our approach in America has been, in Europe, I mean, I went to, there's a great museum in Paris that um, of of standards and innovation, and you can see the original meter. It was designed by the king. The king said, "Okay, this is it." It's
The actual meter of weight, you mean?
Yeah,
or the meter, the length, and then the lead as
length,
well as
length,
kilo.
and weights,
Right.
and it was all designed, by the king. Okay, and the king said, "That's it." Our approach here has been different. We have said, the private sector is probably knows more about this than the government will, but what the government needs to do is to create an open, honest, transparent process where the private sector decides what are going to be the measures. And that system has worked remarkably well. Okay. But we're now in a competition in the international era where a US approach, which is based on companies wanting to come together and say, okay, this is going to be the best approach. They have the tech, but we're up against places like China where they've decided that winning the measure contest is going to favor their industries. So if you go to international measures standing conferences today, the Chinese will have 10 times as many people there compared to Americans. Now, are they wrong to do that? Well, no, they understand the importance of it. But what do we need to do? We need to start putting more emphasis on getting the right people to these international standard setting conferences. Now, I don't think we do that by making it a government activity, but the government could offer, I don't know, call it scholarships or whatever, to university academics that are experts in the area and cover their expenses for going. We're not going to tell them what to think, but we can make them there and put them into the venue. I think we're going to have to do things like that if we're going to succeed in this great competition going forward.
Really important issue, and one that's little understood or studied, and something that we're hopefully trying to shed a little more light on at CSIS. So Thank you for that. Stephanie?
Well, and just on the great competition point, and actually referring to your previous answer about the importance of education, I think another thing that China has actually done a very good job at is just investing in their human capital and investing in particular in STEM. And that's something I think that actually would be good for our own competitiveness, and that we can do kind of independent of what China might be doing, which actually gets back to kind of this prioritization question. And if we put it in kind of specific fiscal terms and what we prioritize, I think many fans of CSIS will know that you, prior to coming to CSIS, were Deputy Secretary of Defense, but you also, prior to that, were a comptroller at DoD and responsible for the procurement and expenditure there at DoD, which is a huge part of our budget now. But we're looking into a future where we've got massive fiscal deficits and a lot of competing needs. So how worried, I guess, are you about the fiscal trajectory of the US? And what might that fiscal trajectory mean for how we prioritize spending into the future?
Oh, gosh. Stephanie, I'm very worried about it. Because the massive deficits that we are registering every year with our federal budget activity are going to be constraining the innovation side of the U.S. government. It's going to constrain how much money goes to the National Science Foundation, to the Department of Energy, to the research labs. to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to the DoD labs. Massive deficits are going to inhibit how much work we're going to be able to do. Now, I think we're still a pretty incremental country the way we do budgets, so I don't see a precipitous decline. But I also think that the sentiment is static. It's not a dynamic world when in the federal government. So I think the greatest challenge for us is to think of new ways to stimulate the creative impulses in this country, but not have it be dependent on federal appropriations. And that's going to be hard because, we tend to think in the federal government, we tend to think we have two tools. We spend money or we regulate how the private sector behaves. We are not used to thinking about creating innovation ecosystems, to create new ideas. Now we're seeing that at the state and local level. I see that at, just up in Massachusetts, for example, there's a great impulse coming from their marvelous universities working with the state government to create incubator funds, for biotechnology research and advancement. But we're not seeing that coming at the federal level. I think the federal level is pretty static. And one of the great challenges is for the next administration, how do you create incentives without making it just a fiscal policy spending approach? Because that's not going to go very far. But there's astounding capital available in this country if you can mobilize incentives in the right way. And that's going to be the challenge. I don't think either party has a particularly creative framework for this yet, but that's going to be the innovation opportunity if we can break through.
Well, and I think you may be alluding to a topic that's been hotly debated in recent months, which is one of industrial policy and the degree to which government should be supporting certain sectors. You'd said before that the US traditionally has not been in the business of picking winners and losers, but we also know that there's been a push in the direction of industrial policy in certain sectors. What do you think about that approach? Does that kind of qualify as one of the innovations you're talking about, or is it something we should be leery of?
We have this, there's a very broadly based popular sentiment that industrial policy is a mistake and we shouldn't be doing it. But if you think back on America's history, we've had some remarkably important and successful industrial policy initiatives. Abraham Lincoln created the land grant university system. We had after the Civil War, we gave great incentives to railroads to open up the Midwest and the Upper Plains. We gave them concessionary rights to large tracts of public land in exchange for building railroads. More in a more modern sense, President Eisenhower launched the interstate highway system. Even more recently, the Department of Defense, we spent about $36 billion to build GPS, and GPS has fundamentally transformed modern economies. Every dollar transferred from one bank in America to another bank is tagged with a timestamp from GPS. So we made strategic investments. Look at the genome. The Genome Project started off as a way to occupy the scientists at the nuclear laboratories. And it was Pete Domenici that put money in so that the genome started to be developed in the nuclear weapons labs. Okay, we've done a lot of industrial policy. I think what's happened is that the popular sentiment about industrial policy has been trivialized, by examples like Solyndra, the company that was going to do, flexible solar cells, stuff like that. I mean, we've had episodes where efforts to try to boost productivity has been trivialized, but foundationally, we've done a pretty good and important job on industrial policy. For 50 years, DARPA has put a third of its funding into advanced mathematics, into a core of important universities. So we have done this. What we need to do now is to amplify it, make it bigger on things like artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, new material sciences. We don't pick winners and losers as companies, but we provide that intellectual infrastructure that people can take advantage of. It strikes me that that's going to be the bigger challenge for America if we're going to succeed against China. China is doing that.
This is great stuff, and a lot of the points that you made are touched on in our innovation paper in the Trade Commission. Increasing federal R&D investment back to the sort of post-Sputnik levels, or at least higher than it's fallen, which is pre-Sputnik levels now, like 0.6% of GDP. Get that number up. Invest in categories of technologies like the ones you mentioned, AI, quantum, others, not in individual companies. And then use the power of government as a consumer, as a purchaser, to really make markets in some of these critical pre-commercial technologies. That's something that Rick Levin and our commission, former president of Yale, brought to the table, and terrific insight, and obvious to you, but it was a real revolution when we were discussing this. Let me just ask a final question, then we're going to go to questions. And if you have questions, we've gotten some good ones, but we're still welcoming them. Let me just ask, in a way, a related question. One of the ideas that Rick Levin gave was, you could use government's need for technology for processing, tax returns or processing all kinds of government information as a buyer of AI solutions, for example. And that sort of leads in my mind to the notion of a competent government and what government should be doing. And as a former civil servant myself, and you were a public servant, working on the Hill, and it's hard not to feel concerned that we have not got the same capability maybe that we once did, and that this is so fundamental, the people and the technology and the systems that we need. How worried are you about that, and what do you think, kind of in big picture terms, we ought to be doing about that?
There are, Matt, there are so many innovative new business models that have been pioneered in the private sector over the last 10 to 15 years, and the federal government is woefully behind in embracing. I'll just give you a couple of examples. After a hurricane comes ashore and it wipes out a lot of things, people go to FEMA and they say, geez, I've just been wiped out. And, now there are nefarious types, crooks that come into that and try to gain something. The private sector has developed a small, simple model where you sit down at a computer terminal and you answer 6 questions. Was your previous home at, 4206 Massachusetts Avenue, 4408 Sangamore Road, or 1233, Maple Avenue? And then you pick one. And then they say, well, okay, how many, did that house have 3 bathrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1.5 bathrooms. You go through a series of questions like this, and with 99% accuracy, you'll be able to find out if people are lying or telling the truth. Now, that is a tool that should be made available routinely in the federal government when people are applying for benefits. You can identify who's honest, who's truthful. Now, that's something that's now routinely done in the private sector. But in the federal government, we say, schedule an appointment and come in and sit in front of somebody for 3.5 minutes to try to validate your identity. I mean, come on, give me a break. There are so many opportunities to transform the way. We've got 500 people at Battle Creek, Michigan, in the Defense Disposal Service that are just designed to get rid of things that the federal government no longer wants or needs. Well, I mean, we've got some pretty powerful tools already in the private sector where you can do that online. Why do we employ 500 people to do that? I mean, we've just lack imagination for how to modernize the business activity of the federal government. And I think we would boost the credibility of the government if we were to embrace these things. And the American public would say, okay, they're being good stewards of my money.
Well, another huge topic that we need another episode on by itself. But Stephanie, are we getting, or you want to pick the first question?
Sure. Yeah, we're getting actually quite a few questions in from the audience, which is great. There are a number that are actually focused on the election itself and the uncertainty, I guess, around the election. Let me link a couple of them together. There's one question here that notes just the number of mail-in ballots that have been received and the timing uncertainty around when those will actually be counted. The question is, what does that delay do to the geopolitical situation post November 3rd? And I think a related question here is one, if Trump were to lose and doesn't concede, what then? So a real easy question for you there, but any thoughts on that?
For about 10 years, my wife was a poll worker, out in our county. And the great strength of our electoral system is that in all 3,000 counties in America, and we organize elections from the bottom up. We don't contract from the top down. There are thousands of people like my wife who are there insisting on honesty and accuracy. And I actually think the poll results are going to be quite accurate. I really do have a high confidence in it, and I don't think they're going to go on for weeks. I don't think this is going to be like hanging chads, where we have to assemble, a bunch of people with, looking up at the light and that kind of stuff. I think this is going to come more quickly. There are a few states that are pretty important that don't start the count, until tomorrow during the day and sometimes even into the evening. But, in most of these countries, in most of these states now, it is a machine that's scanning a paper ballot. And I don't personally think this is going to go weeks before we know what happens. And, now will we have a candidate that declares victory and then says anything that changes the initial results is fraudulent? Maybe. But I really do think that over time, I mean, there's such depth in our system that we should just, be patient, and not overreact. I think we'll have clarity. I really do, within a day.
Well, from your lips to God's ear, as it were. So an audience member has bailed me out on trade because I didn't have time to ask you about trade, which I'm very, very interested in, and you are as well. So a simple question: how might a Biden presidency affect the international trade agenda generally, and TPP in particular, the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
This is a big, very, very important question. The Democratic Party has a deep ambivalence about trade modernization because of some of its constituent elements that are intimidated by trade. But if you look at general polling, liberalized trade fares pretty well, even within Democratic circles. So I think it will depend on how Biden chooses to be a leader in this space. How will he define the opportunity to expand the American economy through trade? You don't tend to see bold and controversial statements embraced by candidates. They just don't do that. But I do think that there is an opportunity, and I certainly think it's a national priority for the United States to again become active in TPP and the trade liberalization in Asia.
Okay, terrific. Stephanie, you want to try and sneak one more in if we have one?
I'm going to, given that we have basically a minute, I wanted to ask you maybe where we kind of started off here, and that is on the economic front. What's the biggest economic issue that either party would face coming out of the pandemic and going into 2021?
Well, I think the economic dimension of the pandemic overwhelmingly is a story about educational opportunity in America. Mind workers are doing pretty well. Hand laborers, blue collar workers are really suffering. This is an education issue. And so if I had 5 minutes with the next president, I would say, please make a priority in finding a solution. How do we change the economic opportunities of our citizens by making them more productive in this new world? And that's a big deal. I hate to say it, America is transforming. And I've talked to a lot of, senior business friends, and every one of them says the same thing. They're investing heavily in robotics and artificial intelligence because they're trying to minimize the disruption that comes from something like COVID. Well, okay, how do we do that without leaving behind 30% of Americans that make their living from physically doing things? We've got to find a solution to that. I think it's education.
Well, again, we have a lot more that we could discuss, and we're going to need to do another episode just to cover those points. But we do have to end this. Let me just say that to the questioner who asked about retraining workers, I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to that question in more detail, but please do go to the CSIS Trade Commission on Affirming American Leadership and look at the paper that we've done on workforce issues. We do talk about retraining and have some ideas in there, so I commend that to you. But for now, let me just say thank you to Dr. Hamre for joining us. Really terrific tour de force here, and we appreciate your helping close out the season today.
Everybody has a chance to get their vote in tomorrow. Please do.
All right, thanks. And now, well said. Before everybody goes, we're going to do our usual final segment, the bottom line. This is where we try to highlight another research question we're looking at and to highlight some of the other expertise on our team. Today's bottom line episode features findings from a recent piece we've done on fiscal responses to the COVID-19 in various advanced economies. It's the voiceover is by our program coordinator, Megan Jory, on the CSIS Economics team. I commend it to you, and please stay on and listen to that. But for now, thank you for joining us, and on to the bottom line.
On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic. To combat the economic disruption caused by the pandemic, governments injected massive fiscal and monetary support into their economies. The International Monetary Fund estimates that member countries announced $11.7 trillion in fiscal support, nearly 12% of global GDP, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, far more than was spent in the global financial crisis of 2008. The United States, Japan, and Germany have approved the most fiscal support during the pandemic. Through September 11th, the IMF estimates that the United States has approved $2.4 trillion, or nearly 12% of GDP, in fiscal support. It has also approved over $500 billion in liquidity support. In response to the crisis, Japan has approved 2 large relief packages. The first supplementary budget of 25.7 trillion yen, about $240 billion, was approved by the Diet on April 30th and focused on emergency support to save lives and protect livelihoods. The second $300 billion budget, which was approved less than 2 months later, included low-cost loans to businesses and recapitalized programs from the earlier package. Germany, long known for its fiscal austerity, has spent heavily in response to the crisis. Berlin's relief is characterized by 4 T's: targeted, timely, temporary, and transformative. The IMF estimates that Berlin has approved $316 billion, or around 8% of GDP, in additional spending and foregone revenue, and $1.2 trillion, or over 30% of GDP, in liquidity support. Based on CSIS analysis and fiscal support across the United States, Japan, and Germany, we draw 7 observations to guide future policy. 1. With limited or no room to cut interest rates, advanced economies have relied primarily on fiscal policy to mitigate the crisis. 2. The unemployment rate increased rapidly in the United States, but remained more stable in Germany and Japan. 3. Fiscal support has helped preserve personal incomes across all 3 countries. 4. Federal loan guarantee and low-cost credit facilities have not been heavily utilized in Germany or the United States. 5. Targeted support was generally more effective than broad transfers. 6. U.S. fiscal support has focused on addressing the immediate impacts of the crisis, while Japan and Germany have authorized funding for long-term recovery. 7. The nascent recovery is fragile and incomplete with many downside risks. Countries have taken extraordinary actions to respond to COVID-19 and save lives. Fiscal support thus far has been critical for preserving livelihoods and sustaining businesses. For more on the economic response to COVID-19, please visit the CSIS Economics Program website.